sretna pod suncem, rasti u jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvjetaj zemljoradnih ljudi i neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama napući i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Над страной весенний ветер веет, с каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как невесту родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать.
Yeah.
ce știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și sfut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut.
Hello, everybody, and welcome along. It is the afternoon of the 4th of November 2024, and we kick off a week of exciting election stories with an interesting case of the recent referendum over the constitutional arrangements in Moldova regarding the path to EU accession and the presidential election which was attached to it. And of course, we will be talking about how this relates to the wider struggles going on at the moment. Of course, tomorrow we have the absurd circus in the heart of the empire taking place, where a dribbling, barely coherent drunk goes up against a man who's probably been doing amphetamines since the early 1970s. So really gives you a good indication as to exactly what is going on in terms of who and what power the president actually has in that particular system. But we begin today with a look at the Moldovan election. Now, I wanted to look at this because, of course, if you just simply Google or perhaps you want to do a Bing on the Moldovan election results, you can see a plethora of articles from like The Guardian, The Times, Bloomberg, the usual suspects, regarding how Moldovans have chosen a European future. Now, this, as I'm about to get into, is largely what we in the media trade, shall we say, call bollocks. And this is bollocks on a variety of levels, but we will get into that. Before we get into it, though, I must start by giving you the foreground to what has gone on here. So, Moldova, of course, was a constituent part of the USSR, became independent, nominally independent in 1991, was immediately beset by a civil war, which saw the Prednestrovyan Moldovan Republic, or the eastern part of the country, break away and form a somewhat separate but not legally recognized separate country, generally referred to as Transnistria. And this, of course, was a sign of what was to follow much later in Ukraine. So Transnistria has been sort of part of, but not part of, Moldova since 1991. There is a small Russian peacekeeping contingent there. Now, the state of Moldova since independence has been pretty similar in so many ways to the sad tale that the restoration of capitalism brought to so many of the former Soviet republics, including, of course, Russia itself and neighboring Ukraine and the Baltic states. The only one that evaded the worst of this is, of course, Belarus, for reasons we've gone into earlier. But the pattern is very familiar with all the other former Soviet states, which is a plunge into poverty, a collapse of the birth rate, losing the younger workforce through mass migration, and a general collapse of the level of population. Systematic asset stripping and destruction of the Soviet-built industry, and a rule over these countries by a parasitic oligarchy, some of which have business with the Russian capitalists, some of which have, of course, dreams of essentially putting their nation into the service of US imperialism, none of which have the capacity to do anything positive for the Moldovan proletariat whatsoever. Similar story to that which we were talking about with our guest the other day, Sopor Japaridze, when we were talking about the Georgian situation. So, some statistics, first of all. The poverty rate in Moldova now stands at around 24.5%, and the number of people classified by World Bank statistics as living in poverty is around about 640,000. Now, for a small population, that's quite a lot. The birth rate has been consistently declining since 1988. So, just as Gorbachev started doing his counter-revolutionary business, the population has declined by 450,000 people since 2014. There are, according to various different statistics, over 1 million Moldovans living abroad, half of which are in the European Union countries, and that is the population that, of course, gets to vote. The other half of which has gone east into Russia. So, according to Moldovan government figures, it's about a 50-50 split. Maybe slightly more have gone to the EU, but given that accurate record keeping on those who have gone to Russia isn't exactly the Moldovan government's business. Well, the Moldovan government hasn't done it accurately. These are guesstimates as to how many have gone to Russia, but certainly almost half of those who have left the country have gone east to work in Russia, apparently principally in the construction industries. Now, even in 2020, the year of lockdowns due to COVID, over 50,000 people between the ages of 20 and 49 left Moldova to work elsewhere. In terms of what these migrants do, they send back, of course, a lot of money in the form of remittances. So much so that, according to, again, World Bank figures on this, 12.2% of Moldovan GDP comes from remittances from migrant workers. So this is the situation that Moldova is in now. And indeed, according to an article on Balkan Insight, the Balkan Insight website from 2023, the waves of migration continue to grow out of Moldova. So you have destruction of an industrial base. You have a group of oligarchs grabbing what wealth there is. You have unemployment and poverty in this republic, made worse every single year since supposed independence, and the younger end of the working class leaving in droves to go either to Russia or west into the EU, where they take up low-paid, hyper-exploited positions. This is the background to these recent, the one referendum and one election. Now, in 2014, the current group, led in part by Maya Sandu, the current president, who's just about scraped a re-election victory, came to power displacing what is described as the pro-Russian side. It's difficult to say how pro-Russian they actually are. Some of them have business relationships with Russia, but then again, so did a lot of Ukrainian capitalists as well, prior to 2014 and indeed after 2014. What we can tell, though, even through just going through these statistics for an hour, is that capitalism has done precisely nothing for 90-odd% of the Moldovan population. It has sent their society spiraling backwards. And so the Moldovan population domestically flicks between those who seek closer ties with the East and those who seek closer ties with the West, both of whom have proven to be manifestly inadequate to the task of actually doing anything positive in terms of the economic and social development of Moldova itself. So even though Sandu and her group are in power now, they have not done anything to improve the situation. Economic growth is not improved. Poverty has got slightly worse since they came into power, though it has been on a bad trajectory now for many years. Their promises to clamp down on corruption only led to more corruption. Their promises to reform the judiciary have gone nowhere. And their promises regarding the EU will turn out to largely be illusory. Now, here I am indebted to a report by a writer called Vitaly Sprinciana, who has written on the on a commentary on a website which is somewhat of a pro-EU site, but I think it's a fair commentary. So, with regard to the referendum on EU integration, As the writer Sprinciana makes clear in his report, the referendum was completely unnecessary because it was about enshrining EU integration into the constitution of Moldova. That was already there. According to Sprinciana's writing, the 2014, in 2005, the Moldovan parliament unanimously, and here I'm going to quote directly from the article, unanimously voted for a declaration regarding European integration of Moldova, which proclaimed the irreversibility of EU integration. So this was a referendum that was not needed at all. What they said they wanted to achieve by it in terms of changing the constitution had already been done 19 years earlier and had been upheld in 2010 by the Moldovan, or the highest court in Moldova. So why do it? Well, according to the writer of that article, Sandu and her handlers hoped that tying the EU referendum to her re-election bid would boost her popularity. This proved not to be the case. Half the population inside Moldova voted against the constitutional change, basically a vote against the EU, and the measure on the referendum only managed to pass by a few tiny percentage points, thanks to an overwhelming vote in favour by Moldovans living in the European Union. Moldovans living in Russia were largely denied the opportunity to vote, as only a few polling stations were made available to them, and they were effectively excluded. So this was a rigged vote, basically. If the vote was counted, or I should say, if the vote only counted the votes of those who actually lived and worked in Moldova, the no side, the more anti-EU side, would have won the referendum. It was only when the votes of the EU diaspora came in that the pro-EU measure got through. Now, of course, the diaspora of Moldovans living in the EU might not particularly like the EU very much, but being able to work there with a minimal degree of paperwork is something which does appeal to them, because they've managed to earn more, even doing hyper-exploitative jobs inside EU countries. They've been able to earn more than they would staying at home in Moldova, where there's poverty and unemployment. So that the diaspora in Europe would all vote that way shouldn't exactly be regarded as a surprise, nor should it really be seen as a great endorsement of the EU. It's, for most of them, just a way of trying to keep their visa working arrangements as uncomplicated legally as possible. There is, of course, the other side of this, which is that the EU is sold to those in Moldova who are in favor of it as being a gateway to higher incomes, to being a higher income country. This does not happen to anybody who actually joins it. The high income countries, when they joined the old EEC and EC and later the EU, remain high income countries. So Germany, France, etc. Denmark, Norway, not Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Belgium, the Netherlands remain the high income countries. The Eastern and Central Europeans remain lower income countries and have not seen their situations improve, not really, since joining the EU. The EU is sold on so many lies, almost as many lies as NATO. The biggest of them, though, is to people in the East that if you join it, somehow it is the gateway to riches. This is just simply not the case. And you don't even need to look too far. You can look at what has happened to Ireland, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, to see that whatever temporary burst of wealth comes largely goes to a few individuals. And then a long bill comes, which is, of course, a bill that is presented to the working class. The EU does not lead to prosperity. It leads to stagnation, decline and depression, which is all it's led to in most of the EU countries now. Now, the EU referendum was lost if you only count the votes of those who lived in Moldova. The votes of those who live outside of it helped the pro-EU side win. They wouldn't have won without them. Same is true when it comes to Sandu's re-election. It was looking like it was going to go the other way to her challenger, a guy called Stoyanoglu. But when the votes of the EU diaspora came through, it went to Sandu. So Sandu is the president, really, of, well, the diaspora and the pro-EU people. Like the majority inside Moldova don't want her, just as the majority, well, not going to say they don't want the EU, but they don't want what's being offered by Sandu. And I think many of them will realize what EU membership will truly mean for them. It won't mean wealth going into the country. It will mean a bit of wealth going to a tiny number of people at the top, and the rest of them, rest of Moldova, being essentially more and more exploited by the German capitalist class, and others, French capitalist class, Dutch capitalist class, and probably the Hungarian capitalist class as well. We have more information on Viktor Orban's activities, and we'll be doing a program on that later in the week, thanks to the comrade who posted an interesting report about the development of Hungarian multinational companies. We'll be coming to that later in the week, but they're in on the game as well, which is why Orban, of course, wants to remain in the EU. So this is a bad result for the EU, not that you would know it by looking at their propaganda. They're delighted that the Moldovans have chosen what they call a Euro-Atlantic future, which if anybody comes up to you offering that, then really you should be running in the exact opposite direction. So the actual result of all of this is, of course, that the country is said to be on an irreversible course towards integration into the EU. This is a lie. Moldova doesn't meet the conditions for EU membership right now, probably won't meet them in 5 years' time, probably won't meet them in 10 years' time. So what is being done here? Why is this being talked up so much? Partially because, you've got a bureaucracy in the EU which needs the expansion to justify its existence. So there's that. That's a minor motivation. The bigger motivation, though, is to be seen as winning something. The EU is losing the game in Ukraine, and losing it badly. They're about to be fucked over by both the Russians and the Americans, and left holding the failing Ukraine war, left holding the bag on that one by either Harris or Trump. The policy will be the same, regardless of who wins. So, what is Moldova being offered here? Well, the answer is not very much. The EU membership is being dangled in front of them as a carrot to keep them, to keep this particular donkey walking forward. The plan is to, of course, manipulate Moldova and bring it over into being a solid puppet of really US imperialism. And the means of doing this are to promise EU membership and to promise all the wonderful things that come with that if you're, of course, a corrupt bureaucrat or politician or pro-EU capitalist inside Moldova. Meanwhile, Moldova itself gets ever more repressive, suppressing opposition parties, locking up rival political leaders, etc. So the next stage will probably be that Moldova is kept dangling. The demands will be made for anything which is left under, in terms of a nationalized industry, probably to be privatized. The economy will essentially be turned over to the management of German capitalists and others who want to feast on this particular corpse. And as to EU accession, well, we'll have to see how far that goes. They're in favor of it. They all say they're in favor of it at the moment, but when they look at the amount of poverty and the amount of problems that Moldova has, maybe they'll probably become a whole lot less keen. What they're really interested in is if they can turn Moldova into a weapon against the Russians. That's the only thing they're really interested in. And Sandu and her cabal of corrupt, absolute comprador swines are more than happy to oblige them on that front. So here we stand. Now, is it the triumph, so-called, of Sandu only reveals just how divided the country is, which means that it is likely that Sandu's party will take more repressive measures against the opposition in order to make their own position look more secure. But then that is happening all the way across the EU, so maybe they're a perfect candidate for it. But this is the nature of things now. It's a victory won on a false premise, squeaked out in a country which has been reduced to abject penury by 30 years of capitalist restoration. So much so that a large section of the population is desperate enough to believe the obvious lies from the EU leaders about what membership will bring them. But such is the case all the way across the east of Europe now. So that's the situation in Moldova. We will wait to see how things develop. I'm now going to pause because I will be going through the comments, because we're just doing about an hour today. Then I have some other business to attend to. Right. So hello to Veshnya Pamet. Hello to Svetlana in Moscow. A very snowy Moscow, apparently. Grasinol says, greetings, comrades, from rainy and windy Seattle, Washington. Greetings to you. Svetlana says, fans of the Russian team may be dismayed to hear that we are importing 90 tons of butter from the UAE, of all places, heading here via Iran and the Caspian Sea. Other countries are helping us with dairy products, include India, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Britain. Well, never let it be said that the British capitalist class let their own sanctions stand in the way of making money. Why, says Svetlana, one reason: too many of our farmers are unable to work properly due to the lack of spare parts for farm machinery that they bought abroad before the sanctions began. This problem applies to many other sectors of the Russian economy, including microchips. The idea, popular among many, that Russia hasn't been affected by sanctions is not true. Over the past year, for example, food prices have risen by 30%. Life is good here if you earn at least 3 times the national average. Well, that would be true here as well, to be honest, you know. For most Russians, especially in the provinces, life is a struggle financially. Yeah, I mean, this is where I, of course, have said before, to draw on what Svetlana is saying, that the gamble that the imperialists took, which so far has not worked, on the sanctions, causing a collapse of the Russian government, hasn't worked because the Russian government was able to do enough to stave off a collapse, but apparently import substitution hasn't gone anywhere near far enough in a crucial sector like agriculture. So is it the case that the gamble of the imperialists could still pay off? I doubt it, but it's not inconceivable. It's not inconceivable. I mean, this is where I depart from what I'm going to call the multipolar fanboys, the kind of idiot that entitles all these videos with Russia destroys NATO in capitalized letters. The Russians are not able to be beaten militarily by the NATO forces. That is very much true. But the gamble was never a purely military one. In fact, the military factor was never meant to be the main thing. And Ukraine, by the way, was never meant to win. Ukraine was never meant to actually beat Russia militarily. The NATO planners, the Americans and the British principally, understood that very well. They understood that they stood no chance of overcoming the Russian army in the field. What they could do was stymie it enough to cause a crisis. And this would be combined, of course, with a gigantic amount of sanctions. And they hoped that this would cause a crisis inside Russia itself, and that this would lead to a political collapse of the Putin-led system. That's what they were aiming for. Ukraine, the idea that Ukraine was ever meant to win on the battlefield is a bad joke. They all knew it couldn't. But what was aimed for was to provoke as big a crisis as they could inside Russia itself. And thus far, they haven't managed to do it. Is it an outrageous gamble to think that they could succeed given another year? Well, if we look at reports from inside Russia, such as the comment made there by Svetlana, whose words I trust because she's a long-term viewer and good source of information about life in Russia itself. And it's backed up by other reports from inside Russia. So is the imperialists' gamble that outrageous? It's not that outrageous. It's proven to be wrong thus far. But as the KPRF correctly points out, any struggle conducted within the framework of capitalism in Russia, any struggle against imperialism, is a struggle fought with one arm tied behind the back. Partially because the way that the Russian system works, the way that the Russian governmental system with the various different factions that are taken into consideration by the Putin leadership, shall we say, before acting, it slows down decision making often to a crawl because the Putin system has to work on elite consensus. They, again, like the great majority of the Russian capitalist class, either were against the special military operation, or they are nominally for it, but don't want to have their own personal profit line damaged, their own property endangered by it and its effects. The imperialists know this very well. They have the measure of the Russian ruling class because they've been encouraging the Russian ruling class to dump their ill-gotten gains into European banks and into purchasing properties and various other things inside places like London and Berlin and Paris and New York. So they have the measure of the Russian capitalist class very well. And that is why they thought that they were on to a winner with the sanctions packages and hitting the Russian capitalist class in the pocket directly. Now, where they miscalculated was in the character of the Russian masses, who were determined in terms of the Donbass struggle that this wasn't something that was going to be sacrificed, and it has thus strengthened the hand of those in the Russian system who wish to fight this struggle against NATO. But the reason why there's constant talk of ceasefires, constant talk of discussions at the highest level, etc., regarding the way forward, is because there is this huge group in the ruling class of Russia, again, some of whom are open compradors, some of whom are masked compradors, who would bring it to an end overnight on any terms if they could get away with it. Some of the masked compradors, of course, are very big fans of that old fraud Professor Dugin. Some of them scream Tsarist era patriotic slogans all day, but none of them want to get a hit in the pocket. Again, the imperialists understand that very well, which is why they are proceeding as they are. The imperialists hope that they're not going to, let's dispel something straight away. They're not going to commit their own men, because that would spell destabilization and disaster for them. They know this. What they hope, though, is that they can keep spinning it out until some element of destabilization enters into the Russian political system. That's what they hope. And that destabilization will come about, if it comes from anywhere, via the activities of the Russian ruling class, the Russian capitalist class, a class which I've said before and will repeat again, adds nothing good to the world whatsoever, has only taken Russia backwards, has only sent the nation into decay, and would sell the entire nation to the US imperialists tomorrow if they thought they could get away with it. They so far haven't managed to do so, and we should all be thankful for that. But as the KPRF has correctly pointed out, if the struggle against NATO remains within the confines of existing Russian capitalism, then it's a struggle which is going to be distinctly half-hearted, half measures, done by fits and starts, which is what's happening. It's the reason why things are proceeding so slowly. It is the Soviet industrial legacy that has enabled Russia, and of course the Soviet military legacy, which has enabled them to go as far as they have. But again, things keep getting held up by the fact that the wants and the whims of the bourgeoisie have to be kept pandered to a certain degree by the Russian leadership. So these are, at the very best, these so-called national bourgeois in Russia, these are very shaky allies at the very best. At worst, they are treacherous swines with uber patriotic masks on. That their actions show that that is the case, and their property interests always take them in a reactionary direction. Even those who are sponsoring the Ilian school and having Dugin do symposiums and stuff like that. What they're really interested in is about the same as any capitalist class is interested in, which is the preservation of their property. Now, for some of them, they wanted to be respected by the imperialists, and that respect was denied to them. Their interests weren't respected, which is why they ended up having to back this struggle against NATO. But it's a struggle that they're all looking for a way out of as soon as they can possibly get out of it. So, and this I would agree with the KPRF, it is the Russian masses which have forced this struggle forward. It is the masses of Donbass itself that forced this struggle forward. And it will be them that need to force it to victory against, in the teeth of not just NATO, not just the US imperialists, the British imperialists, but in the teeth of opposition from Russian capitalism, which is looking for a way out. Many of whom are looking for a way out. They're being denied a way out. The imperialists are actually doing the Russians a great favor by they keep denying the Russian capitalists a dignified exit. They will only offer terms of absolute degradation and humiliation and surrender, which the Russian capitalist class at the moment has not found it, has not been either willing to accept or doesn't think it would get away with accepting. Arnold, hello to you, and Arnold says, big news from Britain reported in the Times, royal family are fleecing the public purse for 50 million a year. Is that really news? I mean, this is something we've known for years. The royals in Britain I think they are the second biggest landowners. By that, we don't mean like the individual royals. We mean the royal estate is, I think, the second biggest individual landowner or collective landowner in the country, after the Church of England. And they own a hell of a lot of land which they get rent from every year. So they extract tens of millions in rent. And this is now being reported like it's big news. And we all knew this for decades. But it's interesting that even like the Times has been obliged to report on it now. We'll see where this story goes. But yes, it's unsurprising news. Britain is ruled by a bunch of, fleecing aristocratic scum, basically, who would rob the entire population blind and routinely do so. Same as it ever was. Okay, hello to Jerry and Not a Pacifist and More Time Needed, who joins us from Skeggy. Apparently, Prince William has declared he's going to solve homelessness in Britain in 5 years. Yeah, if he had us the term 5-year plan, we've truly entered the twilight zone. Good evening to Abtin over there in Sweden. Good morning to Bob on the other end of the world in Australia. Hello to Dinner with Franklin. Hello to Vera. And Not a Pacifist. And Harry, who asks, where does the Serbian government stand between the West and the East? Is it a puppet of Washington? Vucic stands where he always stands, which is that he's been sat on the fence so long that his arse has turned to wood. Basically, like, the Serbian bourgeois are a completely treacherous and wretched bunch, and have been they are now. They were a little bit more radical back in the day, talking before 1914. But what you've got in Serbia is a case of a ruling class that was and is, I think, desperate to be invited to join the West, and the mass of the Serbian population that is fundamentally opposed to that. And at the moment, things are in a stalemate. So Vucic, who would join the EU and NATO in a heartbeat, I think, if he thought he could get away with it, is having to stand there and basically pretend he doesn't want to, because no Serbian government could get away with doing that. Now, depends as to how things go. Does NATO fall apart quickly or slowly as to whether Vucic goes in that direction? Now, BRICS is developing to a certain extent, but the power of the imperialists is still there, and it's still a dangerous one. And it still draws various treacherous ruling classes towards it, including the Serbian one. So I would say that this struggle in Serbia is not over by a long way yet. And until the proletariat in all of these countries, whether it is Russia, whether it is Serbia, whether it is Moldova, to go back to where we started from, until organizations, until parties emerge there to lead a real fight for socialism again, and I don't mean social democracy, I mean actual socialism, actually return to the dictatorship of the proletariat, the struggles are all going to be half-assed because they're led by bourgeois types who are very shaky in their allegiances and always have been. Even those who enter the path of struggle against the US imperialists do so very unwillingly and usually have to be pushed and pulled into it by the masses. So the same thing with Vucic. I mean, this is why I just do not take seriously all of the wild gesticulations about traditional values and Eastern conservatism and Duginism or whatever the fuck it is coming from people either in Russia or in Serbia, because like most of the people backing this stuff are like bourgeois types who have, via their class interests and the pursuit of their class interests, train wrecked their countries for decades and made them chronically weak in the face of US aggression. And now they want to turn around and talk about national pride. Now it becomes obvious that the US isn't offering any kind of deal, only complete capitulation. So again, you cannot rely on these people to wage struggles against imperialism. You couldn't 100 years ago, and you can't now. Serbia has a huge lithium mine called Jadar, and Rio Tinto are lurking around it. That's true. Again, Serbian government sitting both sides of every fence. James Goblin says, Russian natality and death rates tell us much more about the state of the economy than any state or multipolar propaganda. That's true. That's very true. Hello to Christopher Rogers out there in Hong Kong, in the People's Republic of China. Hello to Tim Gray, who joins us. And hello to Sean from Falmouth. Grassy Knoll said, during World War II, the Soviet sniper Lyudmila Pavlichenko toured the US with Eleanor Roosevelt. Ah, yes. Oh, how things change. Svetlana says, here we have huge agricultural lands, no excuse for higher food prices. Well, there'd be no excuse for higher food prices in Britain either. I mean, if you look at it, you can see that there's actually quite a lot of productive land in this country that lies idle because it's not profitable for farming to be conducted on it. British agriculture has been on the slide for so many years now due to high production costs and low profit margins. So like half the food consumed in this country, over half of it now comes from overseas. So like we could feed the entire population here just from growing food and rearing animals on the potential agricultural land that we do have, but they don't do it. It's not profitable to do so, so they'd rather get it from overseas, and they of course would rather charge gigantic amounts for it. This is the story of the last few years. No, there's no need for us to have high food prices. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's the way it goes due to the capitalist mode of production that we are in. Hello to Yu Wan from Phoenix, Arizona. Hello to Rista Kostadinov. Rista Kostadinov says Moldovans in the EU have an incentive to vote for the EU because the barrier for travel and living there will be removed. That's true. Thomas Wolf says that they only sent 10,000 ballots to the Russian embassy. Yeah. Albert Witch says they're constantly being told the mantra of improved living conditions, which are, of course, false promises. Indeed, they are. Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk, says, I recall being at a lecture 20 years ago in Bulgaria, where the Bulgarian government minister for EU integration told the audience that if Bulgaria entered the EU, many wonderful things would happen. Yeah, it's the Hail Mary pass of these failed ruling classes that exist in the east of Europe, having assets stripped and destroyed their countries. The EU is like the last promise that these liars make to their populations, having destroyed the industrial base and asset stripped everything. They then declared that we should join the EU because there be riches for the rest of the population. Of course, it turns out not to be true. Rista Costadino says, the irony is before getting asset strips in the 90s and early 2000s, they, as Bulgarians, were better off than Poland and Romania. Geographically, we're not close to Germany to become their cheap manufacturing hub like Poland did, for example. Thomas Wolf is joining us from Oklahoma. Rista Kostadinov says, I mean, Putin is already an old guy. It's not like he can live forever and be the president. If the goal is to remove him, well, hundreds of thousands died for potentially replacing a guy in his 70s. Well, it's never really just about Putin himself. It is about really the limitations that his time in office has seen put on Western ability to hyper exploit Russian resources. So Putin is the shorthand for a whole system that exists in Russia and has for 20 years. Putin going and somebody else from the center of that system taking over wouldn't really change anything. The aim is to destroy the entire political system and bring in like a complete comprador regime initially, or break the whole country up. So Putin's the shorthand. It's the whole system which is their target. JR and KH says, can you discuss why so many Ukrainians that have come here understand the SMO in line with Western mainstream media? Well, because it's the only thing they listen to, because many of them will be from Western Ukraine, where the propaganda of the regime is very strong, and they're rewarded for those who become like talking heads in the media, which isn't very many, but there are rewards for going around and being like a professional apologist for Zelensky if you're a Ukrainian in the West. So I think it's those reasons why. I mean, a lot of those who fled initially came from Western and Central Ukraine, and a lot of them were pro-Maidan, but not pro the consequences. Those who are the most advanced politically, who were formerly citizens of Ukraine, those who were the bravest, those who were the most class conscious, those are the people who rebelled in 2014 and who kept that rebellion going for 8 years. So the ones who fled to the West are the politically uninformed, those who have been subjected to full-blown Banderite propaganda and continue to repeat it. And of course, the Western understanding of the special military operation is all that they know, for many of them anyway. So it's not a surprise that they parrot its lies. Are things moving in the right direction with regard to China? Sabtin. My view on the Chinese situation is that it's more positive now than it was in the period of like Yang Zemin and Hu Jintao, but you still have problems there. They're not the problems that the imperialists say they are, but you have class conflict in China, which is not acknowledged publicly by the Chinese leadership. You have class conflict between, of course, worker and capitalist. And this is something which the Chinese leadership arguably is, I think, no, not arguably, but undeniably is influenced by. They're influenced by the class struggles going on in terms of improving laws that affect workers. They've gone in the right direction in terms of deflating the housing bubble or the property bubble that existed. There's still significant problems there, though. There's still a capitalist class in China that is in the Communist Party itself. So, whereas the situation now is more positive than it was 10 years ago, it's still an active struggle that is going on. The aggression of the imperialists has actually helped to undermine and uproot the compradors that did exist in China. So, in some ways, we should thank Trump and Biden for helping to revitalize the Chinese revolutionary tradition. Where I have great hopes is that the Chinese party still has a strong revolutionary wing, which is evidenced by the turn in the leadership's line towards a more revolutionary line, though not quite there yet, of course. The way in which I would think about it is that Xi's period in charge is reflective of the changing balance inside the Chinese party, that the revolutionary wing is now stronger than it has been for many decades, partially down to the hostility of the imperialists and the unending hostility of the imperialists. But we would be foolish to say that this struggle is inevitably going to only conclude one way. The capitalist class will want to have their control. They are constrained at the moment by the Chinese system, but they will continue to conspire to expand their interests. And we will have to see how that struggle plays out. Where now we, of course, support China in its struggle to reunify the Chinese nation, including, of course, Hong Kong returning to China, Macau returning to China, and ultimately Taiwan returning to China. But as with Russia, whilst we support the struggles of these nations against US imperialism without condition, same with Iran, we would be very foolish to blind ourselves to the actual contradictions that do exist inside any nation, and must at least be knowledgeable of them and be prepared to discuss them openly amongst ourselves, whilst not changing our position on the necessity of backing all of these countries in the struggle with US imperialism. We also have to understand the true nature of the struggles in these countries and not lie to ourselves about where things are or give in to wishful thinking, which too many have done. Svetlana says, Putin got rid of corrupt, underperforming military-related enterprise bosses, but to say key sectors were nationalized is an exaggeration. Putin just put his men in charge for a while. Interesting. Yes, Thomas Wolfe says, recommend watching the presentation given by Harpal Bra with regard to his book, Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. That's on the Proletarian TV page. Yes, not a pacifist is right. Reading the speeches of and the writings of Xi gives you a very good indication as to the state of play inside the Chinese party. You can see the relative strengths of the different forces by reading his speeches. I think they're involved in another period of reorganization. It would seem that they're having to train a whole new generation of up and coming party leaders in a slightly more revolutionary fashion than the previous generation were. So we'll see how this struggle plays out. Stig Pedersen says, many Ukrainians have seen the writing on the wall way before the SMO. All I know in Ukraine knew before 2014 what it was all about. They have been screwed over for decades. Yes, they have. And unfortunately, there was never a vehicle to prevent what was done. Like, Party of the Regions was not a vehicle that could prevent the Maidan. Yanukovych was not a leader under any meaningful definition of the term. The man was weak, running a very divided organization, partially based on the power of, like, again, the more Russian aligned sections of the capitalist class, which are just as weak, corrupt, and pathetic as the pro-EU, pro-NATO side of it, pro-US side of it. So again, you can't rely on these capitalist types, the even supposedly like the pro-Russian capitalist class in Ukraine was always incredibly weak and was much more terrified of the power of the Ukrainian proletariat than they were of the Banderists or the US imperialists or the Russians. So this is why you just cannot rely on any bourgeois to wage a struggle effectively. They're, again, much more worried about their position and their property so-called rights than they are about any given particular struggle. So moving on then to talk about a couple of other things. We're looking at going to be doing tomorrow a special on the US election. So going to be starting off with a discussion about that. Probably going to start fairly late on. So tomorrow's show will end up being probably a start time of about 10:30, which the aim of which will be, of course, to see if we can catch any like key polling indicators. And then later in the week, we're going to be having Kit Clarenberg back on. He and I are in the process of discussing doing a weekly program about the about various different things. We're going to call it Empire's Fall or something like that. Basically, interrogating the end or the declining system of imperialism in the West, which is obviously a speciality of his in terms of him being a journalist, and a speciality of mine in terms of, if you had to put a name on what I do, I suppose you'd call it analyst of some variety or another. So we hoping to put together a program either once a week or every other week where he comes on and we talk through some reporting that he's done, because there's always something interesting to discuss. So we got that coming up later in the week. The US election, I mean, I'll just say a couple of words about it now. Really, it doesn't matter who wins. It really doesn't. There was an argument for Trump as a disruptive influence in 2016, a potentially disruptive influence. That argument does not exist anymore. And I think on this, the rather iconoclastic personage of Michael Tracy is largely correct in the writing he did on this recently, where he pointed out that Trump's actual record was one of militarism and murder, just as much as Biden's is. Like Trump made the situation in Ukraine, which is what we've just been talking about, so much worse. He went much further than Obama did. I mean, Obama started the situation, but Trump came in and made it all worse, while saying that I'm going to pursue great relationships. I get on very well with Putin. It's going to be great. I'll make one phone call. It'll all be over. And I think Michael Tracy is correct when he says it's bullshit. And he's right. There's no argument over Trump's actual record. Like, increased arms shipments to Ukraine, walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, undermined what was left of arms control treaties with the Russians, expanded NATO again. Like, everything Trump did made war more likely. So how is he the guy that's going to end wars? It's garbage. And don't come at me, I know none of this audience is going to, but anybody come at me about, well, Nixon talked a big game and Nixon made peace. Johnson was already making peace. Johnson knew he'd lost in Vietnam. Nixon just had to complete the job. And by the way, Nixon undermined the talks on his way in so he could gain an advantage in the election. So Trump, full of shit, but then again, he's made a career off it, so why would he change now? The inexcusable thing is the way that many people have absolutely decided, especially in the so-called alternative media sphere, that this fucking con man is what he promises to be. And he's just so obviously not. Like, even if we took Trump at his word that, I can end it all with a phone call. It'll be a great phone call. It'll be the best phone call. It'll be a perfect phone call. Even if Trump was as good as his word and tried to end it with a phone call, well, by this stage, the Russian government, even if the Russian comprador elements were stronger than they are, like, the Russian government's not in a position to accept anything less than the aims set out by Putin originally when the special military operation was began. If Putin accepts less than that, or if the Russian government, I should say, accepts less than that, the Russian system will be in severe trouble. I mean, a lot of Russians will be, I imagine, feel very betrayed if less than the publicly stated aims are actually achieved. And the imperialists will have got their way in terms of creating instability in Russia. But I don't think that the Trump is going to get what he wants via a phone call. I think things are too far gone. I think Trump, with regard to Ukraine, will follow the same policy as Harris. And Harris doesn't have a mind of her own. So her policy will be whatever the consensus of the Washington, D.C. bureaucracy and think tank world come up with, which of course is who the ruling class outsource their thinking to. What they'll do is just continue. They'll aim to keep the war going. There won't be as much funding coming from the US, that whether it's Trump or Harris. There will be pressure on the Europeans to fund it more, pressure from both the Americans and the British to fund it more. Britain's already said it's going to be $3 billion a year for the Ukraine war. I never say for Ukraine, because Ukrainians ain't seen any of that. Well, maybe a few Ukrainians right at the top. So what they're going to do, and this is where the consensus is going, is, and this refers back to Svetlana's comment from earlier on, what they aim to do is to keep the war going at all costs. Or more specifically, keep Ukraine in the fight at all costs to Ukraine. That is what they will do. And they will continue this in the hope that the sanctions do more damage, that the Russian economy runs into trouble, that it creates internal problems for the Russian government, all of which are gambles which so far have not worked, but it's not outside of the realms of possibility that it might work in the future. So they will keep going. because they're seeing, I mean, they make up a lot of bullshit about the Russian economy. They engage in a lot of wishful thinking publicly. They fill their papers full of just pure propaganda. But on some level, the imperialists are aware of the actual problems inside Russia. Like they were caught out to a degree by the resilience built into the system prior to 2022. But they can see that there are problems there, and they will continue to try and exploit them. So the victory for Russia will depend upon the determination of the Russian masses. Because if it's left up to the Russian bourgeois, my God, this war would have ended before it began. That shower of miserable cowards would have run and waved the white flag as soon as Biden lifted a decrepit finger. But to go back to the Harris and Trump, yeah, there'll be the policy will be just keep the war ticking over. Make sure Ukraine mobilizes more people. And that will be done. Trump will hoot and holler and make a big noise. We don't do anything to derail this effort. As long as it doesn't require him to publicly commit himself to more spending on Ukraine, he won't care. So if the whole thing gets shunted off to the Europeans and made to be their problem, and then Trump gets on with trying to start a war with China, which is what the other part of the DC bureaucracy and think tank world wants. So yeah, the arguments for Trump don't exist. There are no positive arguments for Trump. There's no positive arguments for Harris either, of course. I mean, the grotesque dishonesty from the pro-Democrat left this time is a useful thing to observe, though, because when it comes to the Harris campaign, because her and Biden are tied, of course, very publicly to the murderous rampages of the what I will call the US colonial forces labeled as Israeli. Because they're directly associated with that, it's damaging them, not just amongst Arab and Muslim voters, but more broadly. And it's actually forcing a lot of people in the United States, maybe for the first time, to look at just how bad and just how murderous the empire that we both sit at the heart of really is. And that's a educational process for many hundreds of thousands of Americans viewing it with disgust and seeing how most of the institutional left in the United States is still prepared to say that, oh, Trump is worse, despite the fact that Biden, even if we discount the genocide, even if we did put that to one side, Biden throughout his whole career has been worse. And Kamala, through her whole career, has done far more damage to working class and poor Americans than Trump has. And Trump, of course, is a bastard property developer from New York. Harris has thrown far more innocent people in prison than Trump. Harris used prison slave labor to fight forest fires, including people who should have been released, but she kept them on, presumably so she could force them to fight fires for a pittance. Like, Harris is a monster. A monster produced by the rapacious and oligarchical system of Democratic Party ruled California. Though, of course, I had to laugh when I saw that moron Tucker Carlson babbling on about prior to the Democrats, California was a paradise. It's like, for who? Maybe for people on Tucker Carlson's income level, but then again, it's still probably looking pretty good for them anyway. Maybe they just get very upset about the fact that they see more homeless people these days. But there is no choice. This is the point. Like, anybody trying to tell you that there is like some kind of positive choice in either direction is an absolute fucking liar, an opportunist of the worst kind. So tomorrow we will return and we will be looking at the horrors of the US presidential election. Offers nothing really for the American worker. The only amusing thing will be to see the meltdowns of the partisans who have aligned themselves with themselves and invested themselves in either half of these oligarchical parties. So this is, of course, something which I encourage you to tune in to. Be sure to like and share this stream if you haven't done so already. Check out our free recent discussion and interview episodes with Kit Clarenberg, Sopo Jarbaridza, and of course the one we did with Carlos Garrido of the American Communist Party just the other day. So I'll be back to you tomorrow. Come back to you tomorrow for coverage of the American circus. Expect plenty of Trump impressions and other things as well. Until then, I'll thank all of you who have watched today, and I'll thank everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. Always welcome the support if you can possibly do so. Again, thanks for watching today. Back with you again tomorrow. Now, I throw you back over to some music.